And welcome to episode 2 of the Home Lab Heroes. And we're excited to invite Dr. Rich Lane to come and share his origin story. Why don't we start off with your origin story being, what is the earliest memory of something that you built, either mechanical or electronic or both?
Well, hey, just call me Rich. I guess the question would be, if you're talking strictly electronics, do you remember Dick Smith when it was still Dick Smith and not part of Kogan, and they had those little electronic board things you could get, and you could make personal alarms and sound things and all those type of things. So in terms of strictly electronics, I tinkered around with them and put an alarm on my bedroom door at my house and my parents' house, I should say. So in terms of electronics, those, in terms of computers, a bit earlier than that, I was fortunate. My father worked for one of the major banks, and he brought home an early model Toshiba T1200. And this thing was like a boat anchor. It was a brick. It wasn't even a brick. It was so heavy. But it was an XT computer with a low density 720 CGA LCD screen, So, and probably the earliest memory of that was, I guess, a couple of years later, as computers do, the battery died and no one knew what was wrong with it. But I figured out that if I switched it off and on really quickly, I could get it to work. So I've determined that it must use a little bit of battery before it turns on the computer. So I diagnosed it and said, order a new battery. And this huge battery came with these big cells in it. And we opened it up and we tinkered around and we fixed it. And that was like one of the first earliest kind of memories I've had of taking something apart and figuring out how to fix it. So.
And what did you install on that? Did it become a personal home device since it was a formerly part of the bank, or was it a work machine for your dad?
No. I mean, install is not the right word. It has no hard drive. So you were putting in floppy disks. And I remember I originally didn't know there was obviously it's obvious now, but there was a five and a quarter, which held, I think, 360K. And I didn't realize that you could format a 3.5 inch to 720K. So I was formatting them all wrong, thinking, oh, it's just a smaller size, right? But it's actually, half the size, double the space. And when I figured that out, I was like, I can fit twice the amount of things on it. So you didn't really install stuff. You definitely had to manage disks and everything. Like if you were to play a game or something, I remember I was very into and if anyone's around my age, of the Sierra games, so like King's Quest and Police Quest and all those type of games. And I think that one of the earliest ones was King's Quest. And I think when King's Quest 3 came out, you had to switch discs, and it was very interesting. So there wasn't, to answer your question, there wasn't, pre-installed stuff. Obviously we had Lotus 123. I think it was actually called WordStar 2000 was the piece of software. And it was all text-based and stuff, but there definitely wasn't any sort of lockdown or anything installed on it. It was very much a computer for typing, or almost a glorified typewriter. So,
Wow. So since then, when was the first time you actually used your own money to buy a computer or to build your own computer?
I would scrap around. Like I remember my old high school didn't want a whole bunch of old XTs, and they were just throwing them away. But they were the original IBM home computer XT. That was that big, square block with the big screen, like that you traditionally see in sort of an 80s throwback movie, with the two big 5.25 drives in the front of it. And it had an external 20 megabyte hard drive that was as big as the computer. It was like this big. So that was my next computer. But what I I knew at that point I needed a better computer. We saved up and bought a 386. Then, using my own money and whatever part-time job I had at the time, I bought a 486, and that was I think a DX50 or something like that, or it wasn't a DX2, it was a DX50. And I spent $5,000 on this computer. And it had a cache controller. It had, I think, like 8 megs of memory, or 16 megs of memory, which was actually, no, I think it was only like 4. Because the hard drive was only 40 megabytes. So, if I had 16 megabytes of memory, that would have been way too much. But that computer lasted me a long time, and I constantly upgraded it with sound cards, and I think I swapped the chip to I swapped the motherboard to a DX266 a bit later. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
But that's $5,000. That's bloody. How long did it take for you to save up $5,000 back then? It would have been a big dollar amount.
I had 2 jobs. One was, I wouldn't call it a chef's assistant. It was more like the cleaning guy at an Italian restaurant. And I had a job at a Chinese restaurant as a waiter, which was good because you could get tips. You couldn't get tips being the cleaning boy, but I figured out a way to get tips, which is you give people a lot of change. So obviously before tap, and you go, "Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't have any dollar coins," and you give them like 2 10-cent pieces and a couple of 20s and a 50 cents. And they're like, "I don't want this." And you're like, "Yes, I know you don't want that." So I could end up getting reasonable amount of money. Yeah, it took me a while to save up for it, but eventually, I think it was a year and a bit, and I got it. So.
And what was the connectivity that you had? Were you already on dial-up, or had that already rolled out into
I had internet, like sort of like telnet access internet before www, back in about 92. And I used to telnet to chat servers all around the world. But the modems I used, I think my first one was 300 baud, which is like absolutely, you could send a postcard quicker these days. And then I went to 1200, 2400, 9600, and then I think I jumped to 56, which is, I think it was the maximum you could get out of a phone line or a copper phone line. And even then, you were lucky depending on who you were calling, and if it was raining or something, you were lucky to get that kind of speed.
Did you ever get into BBSs, or maybe even host a BBS?
I got into BBSs. So
what was that like in Australia?
There was a good scene. So I had friends in both Commodore Amiga and PC, and they were kind of at war at each other, which one's better and whatever. But, in the scheme of things, we're all there to do the same thing. And they had something called FidoNet, and FidoNet was kind of how email got sent around. And what they would do is if you wrote something in FidoNet, it would then send it to someone else, and it was kind of like a distributed email system, and it would eventually get to where you wanted to send it. And this is similar to Usenets and all that kind of stuff that you'd have now. But Sydney had some pretty good bulletin boards. I personally tried to run one for a while. So I had a bulletin board with, I think I was running on a 40 megabyte hard drive. But I used to be, I don't know why, I just used to love the concept of computer viruses. So I always had the latest virus scanners and things like that. And I tried to tell people that you should log into my BBS because I've got the latest version of McAfee you can download and stuff. And then when I did a course when I was in year 10, which introduced me to Pascal. And I really got bitten by the programming bug at that point. And there was actually a group. There used to be a demo scene there still is. There was a demo scene in
what's a demo? What's a demo?
So a demo was you'd have a demo group, right? And you'd have a music guy, you'd have a sound guy, you'd have obviously developers and coders. And what they're trying to achieve is they're demoing their skills, how good they can make. And this is when you're limited. Right now, you can make any sound on a computer. You can make any 3D graphics. This is before 3D accelerator cards, before advanced sound, before an MP3 was a file, so you were generating those sounds using, track computer software called trackers, which are just like digital workshop, like DAW type pieces of software. So, and you were combining them into this interactive demo, which was a showcase of programming skills, 3D skills, art skills, and they would compete. So you'd go to these competitions. The most famous one was called Assembly. And there was a group, and this is what I'm getting back to my programming. There was a group called Future Crew, and you've got to Google them, because when they came out, and they wrote their own tracking software. They wrote 2 demos. One was called Unreal and one was called Second Reality. And when they came out, just everyone that saw it, their jaws dropped. It was like, and if you look at it now, you're like, well, what's so amazing about that? But if you think about it, and this was running on 386s and 486s.
So what year? What year was that?
92, 93. And I think Second Reality came out in 94.
So this is post. This is pre-internet. So they would. How would they deliver these demos
all
to each
through
other?
bulletin boards. All through bulletin boards. So you would log in and it would say demo, and you would download it. And I remember it was a 2 megabyte file, thinking, whoa, this thing's huge. And yeah, you would download them, and I was into that scene as well. So we've kind of converged off BBSs, but I ended up writing my own BBS software because I was interested in Pascal. And in the demo groups, Future Crew, an interview with them showed that while they were writing in assembler, they were using Pascal as the, I guess, interface or the IDE. I was Turbo Pascal or Borland Turbo Pascal or something like that. So that really got me, wow, they're using it. I should learn more about that. So so that's kind of the long journey I had. So yeah.
That's really cool. I mean, I think there's kind of a lot to unpack there, because you've got amazing compression for these demos, because these demos were like, how long typically? Like, they were pretty long, probably over a minute long, right?
Well, they're definitely over a minute. And everyone would, it's almost like game cartridge programming, where you've got a ROM and you can only put, you've got so many megabytes, or so many kilobytes, I should probably, not even kilobytes, bytes potentially, for the music, and the graphics has this much, and they've all got little architecture, and they have to work to those limits. And for demos, there were different categories, and there was like 4K demo category, 64K demo category, and then I think there was just unlimited category as well. You could, as long as it fits on a floppy disk almost, or you could install it on the computer, was the way it was done. So they did have constraints.
Yeah, there was also some competition between the platforms, right? Between like, the x86 architecture and maybe the Amiga architecture as well. I think, if I remember correctly, there was like a pretty strong Amiga contingent among the people making these demos, right?
Oh, most definitely. Amiga, I would say Amiga before PC, because PC never really had a sound card, like a Sound Blaster, or eventually so everyone moved to Gravis ultrasounds, but the Amiga sort of had, I think they had a chipset for the music as well. So trackers, actually, when I would say trackers, software, music trackers came, like Octamed and stuff like that, came from Amiga. The mod format, the .mod format, is an Amiga, from an Amiga, and then that moved to PCs as these sound cards and Sound Blaster cards came available.
Yeah, if I can remember correctly, there was kind of the kind of attribute that made a sound card really desirable was the number of channels that it had that you could send sounds to. So you could have like multi-channel playback of these arranged samples, which were what these trackers were, right? So, and I think the Amiga, being the older computer, was quite remarkable that it had quite as many channels as it did. And it wasn't until much later in the 90s, I think, that Sound Blaster was really able to push ahead, just like you said with the Gravis Ultrasound, with having just so many channels. And I think at that point, there was also some disruption in the pro audio market, right? Because these audio workstations, which were really expensive, were quickly being threatened by just a Gravis Ultrasound or like a really nice Sound Blaster card, right? Do you remember anything from that?
Yeah, I've got an interesting story. So you're exactly right. They started at 4 channels, they went to 8 channels. PC came along, and I think because you could sort of update the cards, it went to 16, and then it went to 64, and then it went to 128 channels. And that's all simultaneous audio playing. It was really good. An interesting part was I was in a music group, and we were releasing music, and I happened to bump into some people from Central Station Records, which is used to be Oxford Street. And they were releasing CDs, and I got onto this CD, and somehow I got in front of someone that was. Do you remember if you ever went to the cinemas and before the movie played, they showed these slides, and it's like, if you want a pool fence, whatever. So someone asked me to do music for one of them, so I did the music for that, and I did it in a tracker, and I was working at ABC TV at the time, so I had access to. No, that's not right. I was working at Optus Vision, and they had access to a sound studio. So I thought, I'll copy this onto DAT tape. So I took my computer in to copy it onto DAT tape, and we plugged the output of the computer into the most expensive audio software I've ever seen. And the spectrum came up of the audio frequencies used, and it was so narrow. And they said to me, is it supposed to be like that? And I didn't know the difference between quality audio or not. And it was actually not necessarily the hardware that was the problem. It was just the software mixing. It was just not audio enhancing it as much as it did. So I think if you knew what you were doing, you could actually produce some really good stuff. But I think, for example, like when Cubase and those audio packages came out, their mixing available was just so much cleaner. Even the jump, and I'm going a bit ahead here, from like there was a piece of software called, it was Rebirth or Reason or something like that.
Yeah, I think by
Fruity
Propeller
Loops.
Heads. Yeah.
Propeller Heads, yeah. And the audio output of that versus the audio output of Cubase, you can actually hear the difference. Like there's so much more warmth. So I think there was a little bit of post-production that had to be done, but it still wasn't out of the realm of possibility. And actually, many, many years later, I was in England, and I went to a top #1 chart person's studio. So they've reached the #1 chart position in the UK. And I walked into his studio, and he was using a tracker. And I said,
wow.
You're using a tracker? And he didn't realize that I knew what a tracker was. And he quickly covered up his computer and he goes, you can't tell anyone. You can't tell anyone. I said, that's amazing. But he'd had chart hits using a tracker. Obviously, what he'd done is he's taken it to a mixdown studio and got it mixed down, which you had to do at the time. I don't think you really need to do that these days, but definitely when the cost of production, you didn't need a studio. You didn't need all these MIDI equipment. You could do it with samples. And that's continued on to today.
Yeah, I know. I'm kind of surprised trackers kind of were left in the past, because I really think that it's an interesting and novel way of arranging samples. I mean, I don't think it's like particularly innovative. It's just different compared to the typical kind of sound arranging that you do in, like Cubase or some other very kind of music-centric sample arrangement software. It's very kind of, I would call it like programmed sample arrangement with a tracker, because it's really binary in the way that you arrange stuff, but you can quantize it, or you could shuffle it in a way that makes it sound a bit more natural, but it's all very intentional. So, it may be that with Gen Z, we might see a rebirth of that because they really like old technology, right? So we could see something, some new software come out that uses that old format, and I think that would be really cool.
I went to a convention once, like an anime convention, and someone in the comments going to tell me who this is, but there was an artist there that was playing with Game Boys. Like they had some sort of music, 3 or 4 Game Boys, and they were playing the music from the Game Boys. So there's definitely an audience out there for that. So
Yeah, and I know in the there's actually a like a homebrew MIDI instrument club that I'm forgetting the name right now, but they were talking about sourcing Commodore 64 audio chips to get that Commodore 64 kind of chip sound that I think they call
yeah,
it chip techno, but it's just like
chip,
this very
chip
FM
tunes.
synthesis driven. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's just very like they've just fully
Wow.
embraced that kind of FM synthesis sound of that unique, it's kind of like when you play those video games from like the 80s and it's got that very chippy sound to it, it's
Yeah.
something that I think is kind of in some genres embraced.
Yeah, we when I used to live in Japan, and I was connected to the video game industry. I just had a lot of contacts in it, and someone actually got us to write the music for a WiiWare game. If you remember, the Wii had WiiWare games. They had a max limit of 40 megabytes, but the music had to be in a specific format. And the dev kit that we got from Nintendo pretty much made us write in chip tunes. So I think if you were interested in chip music, there's definitely a market to make little games like that. I don't know if there's a Wii development community still out there, but I definitely had fun limiting myself again, because normally when you make music now, it's like you've got so many instruments and so many VSTs and so many different options. Having that limitation brings out creativity, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also like the community has to be quite niche, right? Because you could emulate this music with sample driven VST plugins, right? So you would have to be like only wanting some kind of hardware based system. And then of that, you would want to have chip tunes. So it's kind of like really, really, really niche. But I think those are the types of genres, I think, where you get the most interesting kind of new sounds and new concepts that come out.
Yeah, I mean that also goes back to the conversation about demos, because you would hear a song and you'd be like, "Wow, how are they doing that?" And I remember going to one of these. They used to have things called release parties, where people would go and do these demos and release their demos and stuff. And certain groups would get together and just make songs and do stuff. And someone made a song out of the using a tracker, the documentation for the tracker software, by because it was, I don't know, let's say it's 20k or 30k, but just taking little bits of that and chopping it up into little samples by just using the documentation. So it was very, very interesting. And then they had to put all these effects on them, and that was available to them. So it was really interesting to sort of see as much as you could squeeze out of what you could get. So it was a very interesting time.
Can you describe like maybe a moment in your past where you came across some like technology or hardware or something related to this demo scene, and you were just like, wow, this is so much ahead of everything else, and how that may have shaped the kind of work that you're doing now?
I remember when the Second Reality came out, the demo, there was actually no, it was Unreal. Sorry, the one before that. There was two pieces of demo of that I'd never ever seen before. And you take it for granted now because it was I don't know what you call it, scrolling sprite, not scrolling sprites, but basically how Doom works is Doom or Wolfenstein. It's textures, or it's 2D textures put against a wall. And I'd never ever seen scrolling and scaling sprites before, where you could zoom in multiple and texture walls with it. Like that's never been done before. And when that demo came out, pretty soon, I think it was id Software or whoever made Wolfenstein, they came out with Wolfenstein, and no one. I mean, that was I don't want to say it, but that was the Amiga killer, because Amiga had the best games up until Wolfenstein 3D came out. And when that came out, Amiga was like, whoa, we can kind of get close to that, but we can't do exactly what that did. And it was free for the first 10 levels. And apparently, like if you read other documentations, they were just printing money. People would, it was $30, it was shareware or whatever it was. And people would get the first 10 levels for free. It was a try before you buy type of deal. And then you'd buy the extra 20 or whatever. And then Doom came out. And then I think that was it Doom that was 3D? I think it was Doom was real 3D, and sprites didn't look like sprites on the floor. You could move around them and it was a 3D object. And just those two progressions were just like, whoa. I remember that.
And I mean, I think the Amiga could have done it because they had Lightwave 3D, right? So I think Amiga could have done something like that. It's just that there wasn't anything that was able to do that at the time. Like there was no like 3D game like Wolfenstein or like Doom. But I think that the technology was definitely there, because I remember I was doing fractal landscapes on the Amiga, so it was able to do some pretty amazing stuff. But I think
was
it
it
just
an Amiga 500?
No, this was on an Amiga 2000. Yeah.
So most people had Amiga 500s, and it would probably involve an investment in a 2000 or something like that. And at that point, you're either going to buy into an Amiga architecture or PC. So I think perhaps Amiga or Commodore rode the 500 a bit too long. And when people went to upgrade, they just didn't upgrade to the next generation of Amiga.
Yeah, I think there was also some like bad company decisions at the time. I think they were selling
That's
Amigas
true.
like they would sell a refrigerator or a washing machine. And I think computers were becoming a much more kind of emotional investment, that people were heavily kind of, a lot of their personalities revolved around what kinds of computers they were into. And I don't think Amiga really kind of understood this. So I think that kind of led to problems within, its own company. I think it tried to do a Hail Mary pass with the 1200, I think, and I think it just was too little, too late. So unfortunately, I was a huge Amiga fan, so I was very heartbroken, when the company kind of started to circle the drain. But yeah, definitely kind of went into the 386 x86 architecture after that, and was quite happy with I think 3D Studio in DOS was something I was really into at the time. This was not 3D Studio Max, this was just 3D Studio, which was DOS based app, and I was really into doing 3D work at the time. So
I used to use Autodesk in DOS at school, in my old high school. And we used to have this hockey puck thing, and you would click on things on this big board.
Yeah.
It was all DOS based. So
my university was lucky enough to have some SGI workstations, which were really, really amazing. It was just like alien technology, it was just so fast. But they also circled the drain as well a little bit after that. So, I guess I like technology that circles the drain. I don't know what to tell you.
No, you're an early adopter that finds himself stuck at the end of the queue because you were so early, and the laggards like myself go, hold a minute, that shiny object there with that specific title, that's where the action is, right? If you're too full because you've been market leader for 4 years, that they don't have any more constraints, which is why they don't innovate. And it's almost, if I were to draw a parallel, the battle between the Chinese AI, they got locked out of, buying specific chips in 2018, and then we're now having to go, we have to rethink all of our compute infrastructure, architecture, and even our code base because we can't buy those American chips anymore. We got to redo the whole thing, and then a few years later, see what happens. So it's always interesting how innovation and money and constraint don't necessarily marry up very well. Is that something you've seen, Rich? And now that the AI game is here, maybe a light code-based, low compute AI is going to defeat a massive behemoth, piece of software. What do you think, Rich?
I'll say whatever I say, it won't be it. So, I think there's always going to be cloud computing to some degree, and you'll have, I think storage might move to the cloud. Everything will get connected, but you're still going to need IoT devices, something to, it's not going to be a pure dumb terminal. So I don't know if consumer products are going to get, and again, don't quote me on this, consumer products are going to get much more faster. Some of that compute might go to the cloud, and when, I don't know. So I think more and more devices will be connected. So your fridge will be connected, and this microphone will be connected, and they'll all have an AI button that does something for you, whether it's actually on the machine or cloud tells it what to do. So I think the future has promise, but it is a little bit unknown in terms of how AI will develop. There could be a political change and everyone decides it's not cool to do AI. And, it could be, there's a lot of different shifts that could happen. Apple could come out with a product which totally shifts the market in a totally different direction because they've got the marketing budget to sort of influence so many people in doing that. So I don't think there's one direction, but I always think there'll be a demand for connected devices, whatever that means.
So thank you very much, Dr. Rich Lane, for talking with us. And I hope you enjoyed your trip down memory lane. And this is the second episode of Home Lab Heroes. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys again soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.